China and India benefited from the amount of debt that the United States was acquiring. World output of goods and services increased from $7 trillion in 1950 to $56 trillion in 2004. All right? And then look at the annual income per person, the per capita income increased in the same period by 4 times, roughly three times during the same period. The output increased almost 8 times. Personal income increased about 3 times as well. A period of enormous growth, enormous asset accumulation. In the United States, it's important to know that the United States GDP is roughly $15 trillion right now. All right? And the United States accounts for 21%, and the increased output was 4.4% in 2004. We were going through an enormous growth rate. All right? 4.4% in the United States, the EU at 2.5% as well. Demand was heavy. In Asia, you have these figures over here. Here are the figures of growth. Ukraine was 12.1%. They were starting from a low base. Russia was at 7.1%. Basically, at the beginning of the decade, you had enormous growth that was going on throughout the world. In the United States, however, what was interesting is because it was through globalization that the United States was able to claim this huge growth. If you have a $15 trillion economy and it grows by 4.5%, that is a huge increase in the amount of money in the economy. For a country like Ukraine, which started at a much smaller base, even a 12% increase is not that great. But what we were noticing in the United States is that you had, at the same time that globalization was bringing these benefits, you also had a rise in protectionism. And according to some estimates, the globalization and America's participation in the international markets contributed somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion in annual income. That means for each person, somewhere between $1,650 and $3,300 every year for an American. And the projection was that if you had a Doha agreement, which would liberalize trade even more, you would have an additional $500 billion in economic growth at the end of it. So in terms of just economic forecasting, globalization had a huge potential. But protectionism in the United States has increased. And then the argument, and this is an argument that you will find in any country, was that protectionism was on the rise for 3 reasons. First of all, that a narrow set of industries such as agriculture and apparel manufacturing have been harmed by freer trade, and in response have lobbied hard to turn lawmakers against liberalization. Whenever you have a globalization, you're going to find certain industries that suffer, and the argument is that those industries turn against the general trend of globalization. On the other hand, the incentives for these industries to oppose globalization have not changed in recent years. And there are also many industries that have benefited from and thus lobbied for further liberalization. What is new today is that special interest protectionists are facing a more receptive audience. In point of fact, the number of industries that benefited from globalization far outreached the number of industries that suffered from it. And the shoes-making industry or the sock-making industry in the United States may have been eliminated, but the entire computer services industry created much more wealth in the United States. The second argument is that policymakers and the business community have failed to adequately explain the benefits of freer trade and investment to the public. But in fact, public opinion data show that the opposite. Large majorities of Americans acknowledge these broad benefits. If anything, the public seems to understand certain benefits better than ever. For example, that its enjoyment of relatively affordable toys, DVD players, and other products depends on globalization. In the United States, you couldn't buy a TV that was made in the United States because it would be too expensive. But TVs weren't made in China anymore. Nobody could afford a TV today. I and people know that. When was the last time you bought a small electronic product that was made in the United States? You wouldn't do it. It's too expensive. They're all made in China right now. And finally, there's the security explanation, that the need to balance economic interests with national security concerns has resulted in a more protectionist stance. This may help explain policy debates on certain issues such as immigration, but generally security concerns strengthen rather than weaken the case for further trade and investment liberalization. If you take a look at the United States over the last 10 years, of workers in 7 educational categories: high school dropouts, high school graduates, some college, some graduate, non-professional masters, PhD and MBA, JDs, MDs. Only those in the final top categories with doctorates or professional graduate degrees experienced any growth in mean real earnings between 2000 and 2005, meaning that more than 96% of U.S. workers are in educational groups for which average money earnings have fallen. In contrast to earlier decades, since 2000, even college graduates and those with non-professional master's degrees, 29% of workers in 2005, suffered declines in mean real money earnings. And this gets back really to the point of fairness and prosperity in a society. Because what we have seen in the United States is, although the country, and actually the entire world, got very rich in this period, in the first 6 years of this decade, the reason why you had this vast accumulation of wealth is because not just in the United States, but in other countries as well, you had the richest parts of society accumulating assets, and these people who had assets were then distributing that money towards the growth of the economy. It may not be fair, but it led to an enormous growth in economic activity. And the reaction right now is twofold, because what a lot of people are saying is that the financial services sector and the crisis we are finding in the financial services is proof that there wasn't enough government regulation. And because there wasn't enough government regulation, you have to change that in the future. A couple of things about the financial services sector. Number one, I would argue that the reason the financial services sector in the United States collapsed was not because of a lack of regulation, but because of poor regulation. And in point of fact, it was a policy since 1977, the so-called Community Reinvestment Act, which was not implemented until 1992, when Clinton came into power, which basically said banks had to lend money to poor people in neighborhoods. And if they did not lend money, then they would be penalized by being taken to court. And in the 90s, a number of banks like Citigroup were taken to court